So once again, Andrew King here, Editor-in-Chief of Canadian musician Byron Pascoe of Edwards PC Creative Law is joining me. And we're going to close this poll here. I'll quickly share the results with you. The vast majority of our attendees here, or I shouldn't say vast, the majority of our attendees here are performing and recording artists, which is great. Some music industry professionals as well, which is great. This information is definitely going to help you, be things that you can relay to your clients or whoever you're working with. Put that away, and yeah, let's jump into it here. So thank you for joining us for What's a Band Agreement and Why Do I Need One? Byron, who I'll introduce in a moment, is a music lawyer, as I said, with Edwards PC Creative Law. He's also a pretty avid blogger. If you head to Edwards PC Creative Law's website, not only can you find information about the firm, but there's also a blog there that is full of free and very valuable information. Well, there's a whole myriad of stuff. One of them actually is a piece on band agreements. There's the piece we mentioned before about record label contracts, and a whole lot more. Byron's regularly out there. He's based in Ottawa and does a lot of work with the local music community there. You can often find him on panels. Folk Music Ontario, that conference just happened, and he was helping out. And he's been a great friend and partner to the magazine. So I guess without further ado, Byron, it's a pleasure having you join us. And yeah, right in front of us here is a quick kind of breakdown of everything we're going to be discussing underneath the band agreement umbrella. So we'll talk about just some music legal basics, talk about basics of a band agreement. We'll go through some questions, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how the band agreement works, how it can guide your career, and make sure that you and your bandmates' interests are protected, everyone's treated fairly and according to the decisions that you made early on before anything hit a fan. So, oh, and I should say too, I haven't let Byron talk yet, but to make clear, this presentation is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered as legal advice. If you need legal advice or want to follow up more seriously on anything presented here, we'll give you Byron's contact information, and there's plenty of other entertainment law firms, very reputable ones, across the country. Byron, how are you doing? And please, get us started. Walk us through some of these key legal points that musicians, that artists should be considering before we jump into the band agreement specifically.
Thanks, Andrew. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I'll jump right in. So these are, I just wanted to go over a few legal points that do all relate to band agreements. Regarding planning for success, it's something that I always kind of speak about. And the general concept here, or the point to get across, is that if all goes as planned, did you get everything in writing that you should have? And that's a question that I think is important. I think that, you know, when musicians and singers and singer-songwriters are thinking about any kind of an agreement relating to their band, it's important to think about the question of, if this is successful, will I be happy with this move? Or if I don't sign an agreement with somebody, will that be helpful? If our band is successful, would it have made sense that we entered into a band agreement you know, before we actually started receiving much money? So that's just a general concept of, you know, planning for success. So, you know, I mentioned about whether you should get a band agreement in writing or not, and probably one of the most common questions that lawyers get generally is about whether a verbal agreement is an agreement, and just kind of, you know, the difference between a written agreement and a verbal agreement. And so the general concept here, the takeaway, is that a verbal agreement can be a legally enforceable agreement. There are three elements of an agreement that would make it legally enforceable, namely an offer, an acceptance, and consideration, meaning that each side gets something out of it, even if it's you know, quite small. The challenge with verbal agreements is that people forget what they said, or they choose to forget if what actually happened isn't very favorable. So sometimes people like to change history of what was said, and a way to alleviate that is to get things in writing. The other thing about writing, getting agreement in writing, is that it generally covers more than what you would cover if you're just having a conversation with someone. And it also helps to make sure everybody's on the same page about expectations. Kind of my go-to example regarding this is is a singer-songwriter who goes to see a producer, and sorry about that, going in the back. The producer might think, sorry, what's that?
It is all good.
The producer might think that the money they're getting from the artist is an advance against future sales, and that they're connected to the song forever, and that they're entitled to a portion of the composition. Whereas the artist might think that they're giving the producer some money to produce a song, and that's all they'll ever have to give to the producer. So the takeaway is that having a written agreement helps to outline both parties' expectations of each other, and in the context of a band agreement, it helps to kind of get into some of the issues that you probably wouldn't talk about if you were just talking about how your band's being arranged. So yes, the third comment there is legal stuff doesn't need to be scary. No one likes to read agreements. I'm sure everybody is kind of scrolls through those terms and conditions on everything, and no one reads anything like that. And unfortunately, a lot of artists actually don't read their own agreements that they're asked to sign. But what agreements do is that they provide a lot of clarity about the situation, and that's something that is quite important. Not all lawyers are scary. There are definitely some, but we're not all scary. But that's kind of a general misconception. Another thing about legal stuff not needing to be scary is that sometimes people think it's too late. Even if you're starting to work with someone, or you have worked with someone already for a while, it doesn't mean that you can't now enter into an agreement with them. I mean, in the context of band agreements, a band could be together for 10 years and then decide the next day to enter into a band agreement. So there's no rule that it has to be done from the beginning. And that goes for a variety of music relationships. Another kind of issue with the whole legal thing is that some people, let's say one person in the band thinks it's a good idea to have a band agreement. They may be worried that other people aren't just not going to want to have that kind of awkward conversation. And what I suggest on that front is just to blame me, to say, or any music lawyer or whatever, but just say, someone told me it's a good idea for us to talk about these things, so let's have this awkward conversation, because it's probably a lot better that we talk about these things now as opposed to dealing with issues later on when there's more money involved, or when someone in the group wants to kick someone else out of the group, or whatever else. So it's ideal to kind of have proactive discussions, and that just all relates back to the feeling that someone might have that I shouldn't bring up an agreement with my band because it'll just be awkward. So that's kind of, I think that's enough for what I wanted to talk about these key legal points.
Right on. Yeah, when you were mentioning that last part, it made me think of this as akin to a prenuptial agreement in a few ways, in that it's probably awkward broaching the subject, but when push comes to shove, people are probably happy that they have that in place. So yeah, band agreements specifically. I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about the first point here about the band agreement that people have that they don't know about. So yeah, fill us in on that, and then basically just outline what is a band agreement in however many words it takes you, and are there other names for it, etc.?
So with respect to the first point, I can specifically speak about Ontario, and I'm not sure where everybody on the webinar is based, but in Ontario, there's a law governing partnerships called the Partnership Act. And the gist of it is that if you work with one or more people carrying on a business in common with a view to profit, you're considered as a partnership under the law. And the partnership agreement outlines a variety of things that set out let's say the rules for that partnership. Now, I'm sure I'm sure most musicians have not read the Partnership Acts, let alone know it exists. But if you don't have an agreement already, which would become your agreement, this Partnership Act would be the relevant rules of the game, so to speak. And so if you have a band agreement already, which is this Partnership Act, you may want to know what's there, because you may not like what's there, and you may want to replace it with something else. So I'll give you just a few examples of what's in there. Number one, and this isn't, I'm not reading from the Act, but just these are the general concepts. So one of the concepts is that any of the partners can make binding obligations on behalf of the band. So if you have a band of 5 people, and it's really kind of 2 people making decisions, based on the law, at least in Ontario, anybody in the band can make an obligation on behalf of the band, and they would be, that would be something that the band's stuck with. The second thing is that each member is entitled to share equally in the capital and profits of the business. That's perhaps not how you want to have things roll out with your band. There's also rules about kicking people out, that you can't do that unless it's been already, unless that right has already been provided. So, there's a variety of issues with having your band live by the rules of the Partnership Act, and the very simple way to deal with that is to have an agreement among the band members, and that overrides the Partnership Act. That's the same thing for any kind of partnership in Ontario anyway. It's not necessarily relating to bands specifically, but a band would be considered, generally speaking, a band, if it's not incorporated, would likely, in your situation or anyone's situation, be deemed a partnership. Again, that's not the legal advice, it's legal information, but in many cases, in Ontario anyway, a band would likely be considered a partnership and likely be considered to fall under the rules of this Act. So the way you deal with that, again, is to have a band agreement or a partnership agreement, same thing, which would override the Act. So, to the question of what is a band agreement, and a band agreement is an agreement among the people in the band outlining how they are, basically kind of the rules of the game between the people in the band. As for other names, I guess you can call it a partnership agreement. Band agreement is probably the most common music-related term for that agreement, but like any agreement, it doesn't matter whatsoever what the name of the agreement is. It can be called the, NWC webinars agreement, and it could be your band agreement. So the name of the agreement is somewhat irrelevant. It matters what's in there, and what's in there are how your band is set up. We'll go into the details in a moment about different things that it would include, but basically it's the rules of the game for the people in the band.
Mm-hmm. Well, so yeah, why don't we jump into it then? It's a pretty long list of things that a band agreement could entail, and it's also not an exhaustive one. I'm sure there are other things that we won't touch on that you can tuck under, but once we walk through these, we'll open up for questions. And again, if you have anything you want to ask as we're discussing, just send it in the text box there, and we can bring it up with Byron. I don't mean to hang you out to dry, so to speak, but they're all here just checked off one by one. Can I just leave it to you to walk us through these and just offer a little bit of an outline of each one?
Sounds good. And if you have any questions, just obviously just feel free to interrupt me. So the general structure, my comment there is the question of, is everyone a partner in the band partnership? And you don't have to be. There's often, sometimes there are bands whereby there's a few people, or not all of the band members you might see on stage are part of the actual partnership of the band. So let's say there's a band of 5 people. It could be that the partnership is actually of 3 people, and they hire the other 2 people. So the other 2 people are not partners in the partnership of the band. So general structure, who is actually in the partnership, and you don't have to be in the partnership if you're kind of a member of what we see on stage, and that's not uncommon. Another kind of comment about general structure is, does anyone have a lot more control compared to the other people? And I get into control kind of in a variety of ways in this list here, but in terms of like overall structure, should the band agreement and the band generally be structured in a way that gives one person a lot of control? And oftentimes there are bands where one person is clearly the band leader, they're perhaps the singer-songwriter, like they kind of they're the manager, they just do a lot, they do everything. The band is really them. For example, if it were me and the band was called the Byron Pascoe Band, and and I write everything, I might set up the band agreement so that I really kind of control the show. So those are a couple general structure comments. Responsibilities of the band. So this is kind of the section that covers, what is each person actually responsible to do? One of the things is about rehearsal. Sometimes in band agreements we'll outline, what the expectations are for each person regarding the time they spent for rehearsals. Who's applying to, let's say, Factor or here Ontario Music Fund to get funding for the band. It might perhaps list who's in charge of registering songs with the different organizations like SOCAN, AMROC, Connect, Sound Exchange. So that might be there. Another item that might be covered is about who actually books performances, like who's your internal person who books gigs. Social media, who's responsible for managing, Facebook, Instagram, etc. So those are just some examples of some of the things that might be listed in the kind of section in the band agreement that would cover responsibilities of each of the people. And just, I guess, kind of a general comment is that there's really there aren't, rules about how a band agreement has to be formatted. When I work with bands, and we'll get to it a bit later, but every band agreement is customized based on the band. But I would say that it's important that the band agreement lists what the general responsibilities are of the people in the band. Control decision making. So there's likely a lot of decisions that a band will need to consider at some point, and it's important, I would say, to outline in the band agreement how decisions are made. For example, are decisions made by majority, by unanimous agreement, or some other sort of formula? Back to the band leader scenario, perhaps the band leader has to agree, and then you have at least one other person agree. If you have the decision that has to be made by a majority, and you have, let's say, 4 people in the band, that might be a little difficult to deal with, because it may, the decisions may always be kind of, 2 against 2, which is just kind of leads to a lot of stalemates. So the kinds of decisions I'm talking about are things like hiring or replacing a manager or a booking agent or an accountant or a lawyer, binding the band in contract, for example, for exploitation opportunities, check signing authority, decisions about changing the terms of the band agreement, decisions about borrowing money, selling the band's property, deciding which performances to accept, scheduling rehearsals, other general business decisions. So, like, there's a laundry list of things, and the reality is that for each band it's different, but not every type of decision has to be made the same way. So, for example, a band may decide that if they are entering into an agreement with a third party, namely like a record label or an agent, that everybody has to agree. But for other decisions, for example, regarding deciding what performances to accept, well, maybe that's being decided by, like, Jimmy or whatever. So not every decision has to be made the same way, but the point here is that it's important for everybody to get on the same page about, what kind of decisions are we likely to have here as a group, and what's our process to make decisions. And I mean, really the reason to do this is because you don't want there to be a lot of conflict when a decision comes up. There is going to be conflict, but if you've decided in advance how you're going to make decisions, then when a hard decision comes up, you at least know the process to make that decision. So, this kind of element of a band agreement doesn't remove disputes, but it helps to set out how disputes are dealt with, which is, something that, generally speaking, leads to, less likelihood of a band breaking up over something. So it's important to have, clear outline of how decision making is done.
Right on. Before the music and the money just kind of jump out at me as being key ones here, there's a great question that came in that I just want to jam in front of you before we go on. Yeah, Madeline asks, would a band agreement still be valuable to me if I'm a solo artist who hires a band, not always the same people, to accompany me in live performances?
So what I'd say to that is that I wouldn't say that a band agreement is the relevant kind of formal document to use, but rather some sort of agreement, whether it's verbal or otherwise, that outlines the rights and responsibilities of both people. So if you're kind of hiring, let's say you're hiring 3 people who are come on tour with you and maybe record with you, it would be a good idea to clarify, for example, that they don't have any rights to sales of the music, or they don't have any share of the composition in the compositions, and that they're agreeing that they'll make this band, Madeline's band, their priority. So if there's ever if there's ever kind of overlap between Madeline's band and someone else's band, because they're probably in other bands too, that they'll choose her if there's a conflict. It would outline perhaps how much money they're paid for performances. It might outline, what their fee is for a recording session, like a daily rate. So those are important things to talk about with people that you're hiring to kind of do stuff with you. I wouldn't say that a band agreement is the appropriate tool for that, because I would say that Madeline is the one who makes all the decisions, and she doesn't want to be, or a person in that situation likely wants to be clear with the other people that it's not a partnership, but that the Madeline band is her, and the other people are being hired to work for her, just like any other employee, employee, or employer and contractor relationship. It's important, yeah, I mean, I would say it's important to clarify the things I mentioned, and that can be done, for example, with the conversation, and then you follow up that conversation with an email to say, hey, Ted, I need some more names to play with here. Hey, Ted, as per our discussion, we confirmed that your rate to do performances is $100, and you just kind of outline all the things, and just say, like, just please confirm by email that all of this is correct. I think that would be a helpful thing. I mean, we'll get into split sheets in a little bit, but the bottom line is that if you're a one-off, if you're a person who controls the music, and you're not actually in a partnership, you hire other people to help you with your performances and recording, I would not suggest a band agreement, but rather clarify the relationship in a way that confirms that you are in control and they don't own anything, and basically what they're agreeing to do for you. Yeah, I mean, I can go on, but I feel like I'm going in circles a bit.
No, it's all good. Madeline, if there's anything else you want to jump off on there, feel free to hit me up, but otherwise we'll keep rolling through these.
Okay, so for the music, I'm going to speak to some of the music stuff a bit later in this slide in the context of co-writing aspects. But generally speaking, the comment here about the music is, what's the formula to calculate songwriting percentages and performance rights royalty entitlements? So, like, how are you generally splitting up the compositions with the other people in your band, if you are at all? And I'll get to that a bit later in the co-writing aspects, but the other comment about the music is who kind of makes decisions about the songs, and I'll kind of get to that again in the music placement section. And then with respect to money, so revenue for a band in 2017 is going to come from a variety of places, likely. And I would say that it's important that the band agreement outline how everybody is being compensated from the revenue that's generated from different sources. And it doesn't have to be the same. So for example, it might be that the performance funds, like money you get from doing a performance, is split evenly between everybody in the band. But perhaps something else like music publishing or merchandise or sales of music might be distributed in a different way. Whether that's just kind of changing the percentages or some other type of formula that takes into account who's kind of taking the monetary risk. So it's important really to talk about if money comes in from what, how are we dealing with that? The related point that I briefly brought up was about expenses. So usually there are a lot of expenses that are required before money is, enough money is coming in to pay for all of them. So it's important to outline what the process is for paying for expenses. So for example, if you have a band of 3 people and one of them has a good full-time job and the other 2 people, don't, it's likely that the person with, more money is going to be paying for more expenses. That doesn't have to be the way, I mean, you could decide on whatever formula you want, but, that might just be the reality of it. But so let's say that one person paid a lot of expenses and the other 2 didn't. Is that person getting reimbursed for their expenses before everyone else gets paid? Or like how are you dealing as a band with expenses, about kind of approving expenses, paying for expenses, paying them back? There's a million and one different formulas, but it's important to kind of get a sense of or decide on a formula that everyone is happy with or kind of equally not happy with. Yeah, so I think I'll jump right to royalties related to band members. So, I mean, we could spend a day talking about music royalties, but generally speaking, there are royalties that relate to writing, performing, and owning the master. So, in the context of the band agreement, who gets what? Are you splitting certain things? Are some of these royalties going to some people and other people? And we'll kind of get to that again in the co-writing aspects of this, but just it's important to recognize that there are different royalties that are generated from a variety of things that a band will do and things that they own. So it's a good idea. It's a good idea to learn about royalties. It's a good idea to get set up with the proper organizations, and it's also good in the band agreement context to outline who's getting what. Band assets. So what I'm referring to here is a couple of things. So one is property, like instruments, sets, equipment. Is that owned by individuals or by the band? It probably depends on who paid for stuff or who's going to pay for stuff. Perhaps costumes. Probably the most important band agreement that you haven't thought of or don't think of as a band or band asset. Most important band asset that you may not have thought about as a band asset is the band's name. And the related question is, what happens if the group breaks up or somebody leaves? Who can still use the name, if anybody? If one person, came up with the name, can that person use the name if they leave the band? Probably not, but maybe. So there's endless formulas regarding who is still allowed to use the name or who can use the name of the band if the band changes people. So that's something to think about. Also, if you're in Ontario, you should be registering the name under the Ontario Business Names Act, just Contact Service Ontario. And just a brief note there that registering the name of your band does not grant you exclusive rights to use the band name. Doesn't give you trademark protection, doesn't give you, that kind of protection, but you are legally required to do that. Not that means everyone does it, but something to do is to register the name. New and former members. So it's pretty important, further to my earlier comment that the Partnership Act doesn't allow you to kick out a member unless you've given yourself that right. It's important to talk about the process of people coming in and people leaving the partnership. Again, there are kind of endless ways that this could be structured, but a really important one, at least one that leads to phone calls to me, is how do I deal with this person in our band who left the band? They want to get paid something. What do I do? And so when I get that kind of call, which I get sometimes, the first question is, do you have a band agreement? And the answer is usually no. And so I say, oh, okay, well, maybe next time. But I mean, you could still deal with that issue after someone's left. preferably you're still on somewhat good terms, but usually you're not. But sometimes you are. But in terms of how to deal with this proactively, there are things that we would get to in the band agreement about this that, for example, might provide a formula of the net asset value of the band at the time the person's leaving, and then you figure out how much. Like you set up a formula for what you would be owing them. Perhaps they're getting paid a royalty based on recordings that they're on, but not based on performances that they aren't a part of. There's a variety of things that I would talk about with someone when we set this up, but again, the most common question I get from a band when there's an issue is that the issue is because someone left, and probably not on good terms. And how do we deal with the fact that we never talked about co-writing splits? We never talked about anything. Usually, sometimes a band broke up because someone broke up with somebody else, or whatever other reason, or maybe someone likes Trump. But things happen, and I don't know the average lifespan of a band, but it is a very important aspect of a band agreement to talk about, the process of what happens when people come in or people leave, and or die. But let's not get into something morbid. Anyway, so that's an important thing to talk about. Dissolution is kind of a somewhat related topic. I mean, if everyone leaves and the band's been dissolved, partnership's being dissolved. So, what do you do with the music when the band dissolves? Who administers the rights of the music? Who, still spends the time to make sure that whatever money is out there from royalties and among other things are dealt with? Who, I don't know. I mean, there's a variety of things that are relevant, but it's important to talk about, or it's important to include in the band agreement, I would say, what you deal with, how you deal with dissolution. So that's the breakup of the band, and also what triggers that. So, for example, there's 5 people, and the main person leaves. That might be what the agreement says dissolves the band. Anyway, so that's dissolution. So co-writing aspects. This is the fun stuff. So, well, it's all fun, but if people, so some bands, they kind of write music together. Some bands, one person does everything. Others times it depends on the song. So, there's many different ways this could all be done. But the takeaway relating to band agreements is that I would say it's important to have your formula in the band agreement for how you deal with figuring out who has what rights to the composition. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to learn about a split sheet, which outlines on a song-by-song basis who has what rights to composition and who has what rights to publishing. But I would say that it's important in the band agreement to talk about the general formula for how you decide a composition will be divided. Negotiating with others on behalf of the band. So let's say that the band wants to get an album recorded, produced, and is going to enter into an agreement with a producer. So who in the band is going to be the one who deals with the producer? Who in the band needs to approve the agreement? Those are some of the things that I would think are important to talk about. One of the main reasons is because sometimes producers require that they own a percentage of the composition. And so let's say the band includes 5 people, and 2 people wrote the song in the band, and then some other person in the band is the one negotiating with the producer. It's probably important for the people who co-wrote the song, the composition, or the compositions on the album, to be a part of that discussion whereby they're losing a percentage of the composition to this producer. So, there are a variety of agreements that a band may enter into: record label, publishing, placement opportunity, manager, an agent. I mean, there's a variety of mechanical license agreement. There's a variety of music agreements, and the point here in the context of band agreements is who's going to take the time to actually deal with these things as they come in, who needs to approve them, what's our general process. It's important, I would say, to just talk about that and then to formalize some of that into your band agreement. The next item there is music placement. So the general concept or takeaway is that for music to be placed in a film or a television series or an advertisement or a game, is that who's ever using the music needs to get two sets of rights. The rights to use the master recording and the right to use the composition, which is a synchronization license. So it's important who in the band is making these kinds of decisions. Are these decisions being made by one person? Are they being made by majority of the band? Oftentimes, decisions about approving music placements kind of have to happen immediately, and it's very helpful to have a limited number of people who are given the control to make these kinds of decisions. The related point is about setting up a SOCAN publishing company membership. If you have, let's say, 5 co-writers in a band, let's say all 5 people, even the drummer, are writing music, in order to demonstrate to someone external that, let's say, one person has the ability to make decisions on behalf of the band regarding placing the song with respect to the compositions, one way to deal with that is by setting up a SOCAN publishing company and having that company have the, or rather, administer all of the publishing rights in the composition. Anyway, that's just something to think about setting up a SOCAN publishing company, which might be helpful for a variety of reasons, including when a music placement opportunity comes around. So, those are that's kind of the tip of the iceberg about, kind of 10 or so of the items that would be involved in a band agreement generally. No 2 band agreements look the same, usually. So, every band is different, and for some agreements, some of these types of issues will be a lot more detailed than others, just because some bands, care about certain things more than others. So, anyway, I think that rounds up this section of some of the things that would be likely to appear in a band agreement.
I appreciate it, the marathon. And from here out, we can get more conversational. And actually, another great question that came up while we were going through that. Justin's the only the only songwriter in the 3-piece band, but the music wouldn't be where it is right now without the other 2 members contributing to booking shows, networking, promotion, just the overall performance of the music, etc. So I'd like to split the money evenly. Is that a normal thing? Am I being naive? Do other bands do that? If you don't mind, Byron, maybe I want to spit something out and you can tell us if it's good advice and then offer some of your own. I forget which presenter it was, but in a previous session this had come up with, and basically the point was, you definitely want to be careful about your songwriting rights, but in a case like this where the band, if you feel that the work is being evenly divided amongst everyone, the advice was, just go in as equal shares on the songwriting portion. As the singer/songwriter, you'll get the chance to earn a bit of extra money otherwise for those, acoustic shows or songwriter circles, etc. And, just to keep everyone on a good wavelength. That was their advice. So what are your thoughts on that, Byron?
Sure. Well, one of the things you can do is still pay people a percentage of what you earn without having them be listed as a songwriter. So, you're always allowed to, give someone something even if you're not, so I think we're talking in part about like money from SOCAN in the context of a songwriter. So, let's say you're the only one listed on SOCAN for song registration or composition registration. Let's say you get $200 from SOCAN for some placements that quarter. You can just have an agreement with your band to say, as long as you guys are performing with me and working with me, I'm going to pay each of you, 20% of what I get from SOCAN, or X% of what we get from sales of the music, from online distribution, and from off the stage sales. So there are very simple ways to pay people without having them, listed as a co-writer on SOCAN, for example. The other way to deal with it, like if you do want to list them as a co-writer, what I would suggest is that, well, first off, the first question is like what percentage makes sense. And a third each is fine if that's reasonable. It may make more sense that the main person get 50 and the other two people get 25. But back to the comment earlier about that SOCAN publishing company membership. Mm-hmm. What I would suggest in a situation whereby kind of a singer-songwriter is getting some help from two of the band members, for the variety of things that Justin mentioned, is that perhaps the writer's share is split, whether evenly or not, between the three people, and the publisher's share of each composition is owned by a publishing company that's owned by, in this case, Justin. So Justin would set up a SOCAN publishing membership. It costs $50, and as long as he has 5 compositions that he's written, he would be able to meet that other obligation. You have to submit a simple assignment of rights. But anyway, so he would set up a publishing company. Let's call it like Justin Music Publishing. And so the SOCAN registration would look like this. It would have on the writer's share would be split. That 50% would be split between the 3 people. So for example, let's say it's 20%, 15, 15. And on the publishing side, it would be 50% for Justin's publishing company. What that means is that when there's a song placement opportunity, that Justin's company alone would have the right to make those decisions. And if there's money coming in from SOCAN, let's say it's $100, $15 would go to the other person, $15 would go to the second other person, and then $70 would go to Justin. So that's one way to deal with it. Also, from like a performer royalty point of view, maybe that Justin gets the featured performer royalties, the other 2 people get the non-featured performer royalties. So something to look into is MROC and Sound Exchange regarding performer-related royalties. But again, kind of echoing what I said earlier, you can have it all be listed as as the main person's name, and then they just by contract or not give a share of what they receive to the other people. And there's a question that I think also included, like, what do other bands do? Some bands do some of the different scenarios I discussed. Other bands have just everything equal. Some bands have, one person gets everything, and I guess that's the earlier example. But like, if you could think of an example, there's probably bands out there who are doing it, and whether it's worked for them or not. If it doesn't work for a band for maybe one album, maybe for the next album they do something different. And you can always change, right? I mean, the thing is, any agreement can be changed if all the parties want to agree to that change. So, if initially Justin and the other 2 people decide that, they're going to use the structure of everything being in Justin's name, and he's going to pay them 15% each of whatever he receives, maybe they all decide that doesn't make much sense. So they would just change it. They would change the registration with SOCAN. They would change, whatever else needed to be changed. You're allowed to make changes to your agreement so long as everybody agrees with that change. Band agreements can be changed. I mean, band agreements get revised, over time as things change. So just because it's kind of written, it's not written somewhere, just because you agree to something now doesn't preclude you, doesn't limit you from changing how, if everybody agrees to a change later on, then you're all agreeing to that change. Agreements get amended all the time. By amended, I mean like changed.
No, appreciate that, and shout out, Justin's a friend of mine too. Thanks for joining us, and shout out to Catskills as well. He comes to a lot of these. Yeah, moving on here. So how can a band agreement guide your career, or how a band agreement can guide your career? I should mention too, I kind of skipped over the question slide there because we've been getting them in kind of as they come up
Sure.
But of course, keep them coming, everybody. We'll have some time at the end. We may bleed over the hour a bit here too, but stick with us. We won't keep you too long. Yeah, fill us in a bit about, I like this, about guiding your career and you know, maybe being something of a map to making good decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a band agreement discussion really is about setting your goals as a band. And you know what ideally you want as a band is for all of you to be on the same page about you know, where you want to go together, you know, and how you want to get there. And I think a band agreement is just kind of one small piece of the discussion about, you know, what are we doing here? Like, is this what we all want to do? How do we want to get there? You know, what are our goals? What are our timelines? So I think that, you know, this kind of, so how band agreement can guide your career? Well, you know, it can get you at least talking about some of these things. I mean, I speak to musicians sometimes who are extremely successful, been around for a long time. They've never heard of some of, like, they've never heard of, you know, M-Rock and Connect and Resound, like, which I find interesting. But like, you know, having a discussion about these things just kind of, you know, reminds you that it's important to have, reminds you that it's important to have these kinds of, you know, thinking about these things. But it's really your business plan. I mean, it's not a business plan, but you know, it can be. But you know, setting goals, you know, is a really important thing for band to do. And you know, that kind of comes up when you're talking about the kind of things that are in a band agreement. Sometimes, I mean, again, like every band agreement is different, and I've, like, one comes to mind whereby a band had a very unique kind of, I guess I call it like a mission statement, and like they had a whole kind of document about how they, you know, view each other and just different things about the band, and you know, that kind of thing is not for everybody, but like that was a good starting point for me to understand like what they'll probably, you know, how they would likely want a band agreement to be presented and written, because you know, they had talked about kind of what they all want to do. Anyway, I mean, the point is that having this kind of discussion really kind of helps you to set goals, I think. I mean, it's something that I would encourage. So if I'm talking to a band about a band agreement, what I would say is, you know, what have you been up to? How do you all work together right now? Where do you all want to go? Have that discussion. Let me know. And you know, that just kind of naturally leads into discussions about, you know, what the band wants to do.
Spot on. A great question here. A major, oh, maybe this is part of, I'll save this one actually. Why don't we talk about how a band agreement can protect everyone's interests, just because I think that may very well pertain to this question I want to put.
Well, I think, like, very briefly, I mean, any kind of agreement provides clarity, and it also helps to manage everybody's expectations. And so it can protect everyone's interests because it helps to define what everybody is entitled to and what everybody's responsibilities are. I mean, it's kind of more helpful the earlier it's done. But you know, it's easier to have a conversation about money before there is money. And again, it just, like, this kind of thing, it helps you to manage expectations. It gets everyone on the same page about, you know, what we're expecting other people to do. And you know, if a member of a band is kicked out of the band right before the band kind of gets, you know, a lot bigger and makes a lot more money, a band agreement is probably, you know, their saving grace to ensure there's clarity that they're entitled to something. So, you know, and then on the flip side, if you're someone who's kind of the band leader, but you have a band that's a partnership, you may want it clarified that you call the shots, and you know, you decide if someone is going to be replaced or not, or you know, whatever it is. So, you know, whether someone is kind of the leader of the band or someone who's, you know, not, I think it's important. I think it protects their interests in either case.
Well, yeah, Oh, he puts his name here. I'll say it. Shane says a major problem for our band, four members, is distribution of work. Basically, two of the four do a ton of work, booking, social media, planning, grant writing, etc. The other two, not so much. The members that don't do as much insist on having equal say, control, etc. over most matters. Are there good remedies through the band agreement that could address this, or ways to enforce people's different responsibilities, etc.?
Yeah, I mean that's a very practical challenge. One way to deal with that is to say that the more work you do, the more control you have, but they're not going to agree to that. I mean, the problem is that I'm not going to say that band's going to like break up tomorrow, but it would be a lot stronger if the other two people actually pulled their weight, or if the people that are doing more work get compensated for that. So, I mean, it's I'm not trying to break up that band, but I think it's important that that they it might be a third party. It may be the lawyer, or maybe like someone who's just kind of talking to them about the issues in the band agreement, that would say to them, like the four of them collectively, that the way things generally work is the people who do more work get more out of it, and therefore the only way this band is going to be able to continue is if work is rewarded, and that's either going to get the people who aren't doing anything to do more, or it might lead to something bad happening. But again, I'm not trying to break up the band, but it's a very, very common practical challenge, and it's important, yeah, again, for you to kind of try to get people to recognize that formula of work equals reward. But if they're not today, it's going to be a much bigger issue when something bigger happens with the band.
Well put. Well, what you're saying is you're starting to see this emerge now. Imagine if a big opportunity hits the table or something. At that point, you're sort of past the point of no return. So, yeah.
Well, you're going to lose out. I mean, the people who put in the work are going to, they should be entitled to more, or they should be entitled to have other people help them do the work. I mean, it sounds like the two people are kind of like the managers, and sometimes many bands have a kind of a manager who's internal, and that person, I think, should be compensated for that role. I'm not going to say what the magic number is for how much they should be compensated, but they should. I mean, they're basically, or they are, the manager, and so they should be compensated accordingly. The problem with that situation is that the two other people are sound quite stubborn about the situation, and are probably not going to kind of acknowledge that this one or two people are kind of the band managers. But it may be that you can win them over by saying that the general practice is that whoever the manager is of the band has additional control and has additional compensation going to them because they're doing the work, because they're generating these opportunities, for performances or for just other opportunities generally. And sometimes when people recognize how it's done normally, they give in. But there's going to be some compromises. The people who are doing the most of the work are probably going to be working. Even if there is a change, it's not going to be like as much as they would have liked. That's kind of the reality with making a compromise. But like, hopefully, a compromise can be made that everyone can live with. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Much appreciated. And actually, that kind of leads into the next question in a sense. What I was going to say is a friend of mine's band, what they do is sort of bill their hours. So any work that they're putting into the band that goes beyond things that are covered by licensing, songwriting, etc. But anytime they're putting in work whether it's booking shows on social media, doing promo, like they log those hours. I don't know exactly how their system works, but basically, and they pay out from the band's income individually to members based on work they put in. And there'd be a lot to set up to make a system like that work efficiently, but they seem to have it going on. And they are also incorporated, which is part of the reason they're able to do that so easily. And Ryan wants to know, Byron, in which circumstances would it make sense for a band to form a corporation?
Yeah, and that's an important question. But sorry, what was the just can you mention again the last thing that you said about the other band incorporating? And what was the
Oh, just that like by being incorporated, that they kind of operate like a business, and so
right?
that's whenever any individual member is doing work, quote, on the clock for the business, there's kind of a system where they're then paid out at a agreed upon hourly rate for the work. And
So my comment on that is that you don't have to be incorporated to have that kind of structure.
Sure, sure.
Like the fact that generally speaking, the reason to incorporate is for tax purposes. And I think it would be, so I incorporate musicians and bands all the time. And it is 99% because of tax purposes. And that may be changing with the latest federal discussions about taxes for corporations, but probably not, enough to make it not worthwhile anymore. But I'm not an accountant or a tax lawyer, and so when people say to me, like, is the income I'm making sufficient for it to be worthwhile to incorporate, I say, speak to an accountant. I can give you some names of some music accountants if you want. But that's, I don't have a magic number that I would advise people on is the appropriate time. But there are tax advantages generally of incorporating, and that would likely be the reason why you incorporate. But just to be clear about the the logging hours and everything, I think that's a really good idea if it works for that band. A partnership is a business, just like a corporation. So it's not, you don't have any more or less availability to to log hours and pay people if you're incorporated or not. Just kind of on the incorporation point, just so we all know kind of what the costs are that are involved. In Ontario, anyone in Canada can incorporate either provincially or federally. The costs are a little bit different. In Ontario, it's about $150 more to incorporate provincially than federally. But it's in the range, like, so for my firm, and most lawyers will incorporate people, and you can also do it online. But the way our firm works is that we charge $500 in legal fees plus all disbursements, and the total, including taxes, is between about $900 and $1,050, including all of the government fees, HST, cost for a minute book, and just like the other related, the name search, all that kind of fun stuff. And then there's annual costs because you're actually, you're filing a tax return for a corporation, so you're likely hiring someone to help you do that. But I would think in many situations, it is by far and away you're saving a lot more money in taxes if you incorporate. Yeah, so that was. So what was the rest of the incorporation question? Was it kind of when is the right time?
Yeah, that was it. Well,
Okay.
in what circumstances? So, as you're saying, is
If you're making enough money, I mean, again, I don't have a kind of a magic number, but I would talk to an accountant, and I can recommend some people if you'd like. But it's a fairly common thing that I do. Just another kind of note is that you can either be incorporated as a numbered company or a named company. So you could be, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Canada Inc. or Byron Pascoe Music Inc. So you can choose if you want to be a number, and the number is assigned to you. You don't choose a number, or a name. And if you do a name, then you have to do a name search. There's a whole process for that. But you can either be a company or a name. And if you're federal, then you can more easily be found online for free. So there's a website that you can kind of find federal corporations. So you may not want people to know where you live, and so that's kind of a reason to go provincial. But anyway, we could talk for a while about incorporations, but those are some of the key takeaways for bands or musicians. You don't have to be a band to incorporate. You know, I mean, a lot of, well, like I incorporated a musician today who's a musician based out west, and it's him, and it's like his name, Music Inc. So fairly common for people to incorporate either as a musician or a band, or like a band to incorporate, or for a musician to incorporate.
Bingo. Yeah, there's no more questions in the queue. So this is working really nicely. Kind of flow into, we were going to talk a little bit about your personal process or approach to band agreements to cap us off here. And then, again, this is in your handouts. This recording will go up, and you'll be notified about it so you can access it whenever you want. But there is Byron's info. Again, if you go to edwardslaw.ca too, his blog is there. Tons of free help. But yeah, fill us in about, you know, if someone was going to come to see you to seriously inquire about this, walk us through what that looks like.
Sure. So basically, I get contacted sometimes by people in bands who ask about, you know, what band agreements are all about, and you know, saying that they think they need one. And so what I would do is kind of, you know, talk to the person about kind of how things are going with the band, how decisions are made, like kind of what the process is, what kind of discussions they've had. And I say to them to take a look at my band agreement blog, which kind of has a laundry list of like about 100 questions, and I say, you know, talk to your band about the kinds of things that are in this blog, and then let me know if you still want to, you know, have a band agreement. And that laundry list lists a lot of the questions I mentioned earlier on that kind of filled up slide with all the different bullet points. If a band wants to go ahead, then I would say, okay, let's have a very detailed discussion about a variety of things, including, you know, items that are in that list. And then I would prepare a first draft of the band agreement. The band overall would review it, ask me any questions they have, you know, requests for changes. I would make the changes, and I would give it back to the band, and they would all sign it. So in that kind of situation, I'm kind of playing the role of a secretary. Like, I'm not representing one person in the band and not another person in the band. I'm working for the band generally. In some situations, it might make sense for someone might think that they want to have their own independent legal advice. That doesn't really happen much, but generally speaking, if I'm writing a band agreement for a band, I'm working, you know, for the band, and I am asking, you know, all of the band for feedback, and you know, outlining, making sure that the agreement is consistent with the wishes that they have regarding, you know, how they'd be set up. And I would likely, there's a variety of things that I ask them about that they've never talked about before, and so it just kind of leads to a conversation. And so sometimes that initial call just leads to a conversation the band has, and then they start talking about these things, and I may not hear from them for like a year or more, and then maybe they decide to have a band agreement later on, and maybe I help them with something else in the meantime. But, like, you know, the key takeaway I want to provide today is, like, not that you have to have a band agreement this second, but it's a good idea to talk about the issues that are in a band agreement before it's too late. And the band agreement blog that I have, if you just search my name and you know, Byron Pascoe music blog or music band agreement, you know, you'll find the link for that. It's on my website too.
I did that exact search a couple of hours ago. Sorry.
Okay. So there you go. So I think it's just a good idea for bands to talk about these things, because that's the starting point. And then, you know, you may or may not want to formalize it with an agreement. You may want to just kind of agree to things over email between each other. But you know, there are music lawyers across Canada who can help you, you know, write a band agreement. But I think it's important just to have the discussions about the kinds of issues that are in band agreements, because as I said from the top, like, it likely decreases the likelihood of a band breaking up over a disagreement, and just clarity in general saves time and money and frustration and stress later on. So, you know, like a lot of things in law, it's basically insurance against things later on that might cause you, you know, might be very expensive. after the person leaving the band, you're probably going to end up paying someone someone less if you have a band agreement with them as compared to if they're kind of holding you hostage when you want to kick them out. That's kind of a weird way to end off, but
You want to kick them out.
have a look at the blog and you know, just have that awkward conversation, and definitely blame me or Andrew. Feel free to blame Andrew.
Yeah, and I'll just relay it on to Byron. Again, Byron Pascoe, a very good friend of ours, a very helpful and knowledgeable individual. He mentioned the blog. Again, it's a very, very valuable resource. We've referenced it quite a few times on these webinars and on Canadian Musician Radio and other places. So big thanks to Byron for joining us. As you can see in front of you here, just a few titles. You know, if you want to delve a bit more into music law, entertainment law, there's some books here that we recommend. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier. Oh, what was that, Byron?
I have the middle one.
Oh, is that Paul's book?
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Paul Sanderson, another good friend of the magazine, and we always like to say, literally wrote the book on music and the law in Canada. Yeah, I mentioned for joining us, you know, when you registered, we will not send you spam, but we will send you 24 hours after the session here a link to recording of this session. So if you want to send it to, say, 2 useless band members, wink, 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 or anything like that, you're free to, or just reconsult for down the road. And yeah, as we mentioned at the beginning, this is not to substitute for legal advice. If you need legal advice specific to your situation, consult an entertainment lawyer like Byron. I'm going to lose him when we end here, so I'll just say, again, my name is Andrew King, Canadian musician. Thank you very much for joining us. nwcwebinars.com, you can see recordings of all of our previous sessions, and that's where you can go to register for all of the upcoming ones. Thank you, everybody, and yeah, cheers to a good rest of your evening. Thanks a bunch, Byron.
Thanks.